With the reduction of the multipath effect, as well as the introduction of FOX-3 missiles, some things have changed, and today I want to look at BVR and just some general radar missile tactics and just how to use them in general. Now if you want a full guide on how to set up your radar, how to operate it and all those things, I recommend you check out the video that I put in the description. It's a full guide on the actual radar systems. In today's video I will summarize it very quickly just to have a little bit of background knowledge, so this will be a standalone. But if you want more info, it will all be over there. See the radar like a flashlight, and when you try to shine your flashlight at one thing, you will also illuminate everything around it. So your radar is the flashlight, the planes are mirrors, and the bigger the mirror, the bigger the return, and the bigger the return, well, the more likely the radar is to go for that target instead. It only cares about the brightest target. So if you have something locked up and you see that the missile is still going, just keep your enemy locked up, unless of course you see a missile go for a teammate, then break lock and make sure that the missile doesn't continue to team kill your buddy. Now if you are using FOX-3, this is of course not as relevant, because once the missile goes active, the missile will not care about any inputs that the radar sends its way anymore. Then let's take a quick look at how to use these missiles at long range, because all the lines on the radar screen might get a little bit confusing. I'm using the wide TWS scope here. It's a little bit less accurate, but it makes it easier to find people. After you lock someone, you can narrow it, makes it a little bit more accurate. You have two dots on the radar. The one with the two lines next to it is the one that is selected, and if you want to cycle through them, you can press this button right here. There is no default for it, you need to set it up. Then we have the little frying pan thing underneath the bracketed box, that's the heading. So the little thing that you hold of the frying pan, wherever that is pointing, that is the heading of the plane. I'm waiting for them to get a little bit closer. I'm talking about the MAR and the NEZ in a second, but for now I just want to look at the radar screen. First I want to look at the uninterrupted lines. This is what the missile can see. Then we have the interrupted lines, and this is what the missile cannot see. So if you shoot it at long range and you break radar signature, so you stop updating the missile, and it's in that interrupted line segment and the enemy starts maneuvering, your missile will likely miss. So it's a good idea to keep your radar on the enemy until your missile reaches a point where it can see the target, and then you can safely turn around and make sure that you don't waste your missiles. And then on the right we have three lines. The top one in green is the max range of the missile. Then we have the MAR in red, that is the small line, and I will explain that one in a minute. And then we have the long line that's kind of overlapping the MAR line right now, and that is the targeted enemy, just so you can easily see in what range bracket the enemy is actually located. Now you might say it's pretty cluttered, how am I supposed to tell? Well, you'll see it quite obviously the second your missiles reach them. The little circle around the dot disappear, your missile is now active, and you can safely turn around, and that's exactly what we do right here. I'm staying in the fight for a little bit longer. I'm seeing if I can maybe shoot another missile off, but there's too many. I'm just gonna turn around, and my missiles are on the way. I know that they picked up the enemy, and if they don't watch this video, well, they're gonna be sent straight back to the hangar. Just like that. Let's get on the blackboard and start drawing some modern art. So the radar basically points its cone at an area, and this area will be lit up. Now the non-pulse Doppler radar is super sensitive and basically picks up everything, and this is also why it will not be able to cope with the ground effect. And the ground effect is essentially the light being bounced off the ground enough for the radar to pick it up. And this is why it turns into a hazy mess, because as you might know, the ground is a quite vast area which is all bouncing light back. And this creates a bit of a sensory overload where you see everything and therefore you see nothing. And again, it does taper off. The further away you get from the ground, the less intense the return signal is and the clearer the picture becomes. So it's a lot easier to find out one dot. And then you have chaff. Imagine that these four dots are all planes, and now one of those planes ends up dropping chaff. Are you able to tell what is the brightest return signal in this picture? I'll give you a few seconds. The way you beat these radars is by simply overstimulating them so that they can't see anything anymore. And this is why chaff and the ground are so damn strong. And this is where pulse Doppler comes in. It fixes both of these issues by applying a filter. Now this is again not really accurate, but imagine it like this. You put on sunglasses while looking at the night sky. What do you end up seeing? Only the brightest of stars, and everything that is clutter or like very small dots in the air, you won't be able to see anymore, and now you can focus on what is actually important. Now this is not completely accurate. Of course the faint dots are gone and the bright dot is still there. But this is not how the pulse Doppler works. The filter actually works with speed, or rather with closure rates, and this is the way that it's able to defeat ground clutter. The plane is going 1200 kilometers an hour, and therefore the ground is coming at the plane at 1200 kilometers an hour. The radar will simply say, this is stationary, this is not a plane, and therefore I'm not gonna be showing it to you. And with this logic, if you are able to have a closure rate of 1200 kilometers an hour, the radar will simply filter you out. The speed at which the radar filters you out is dependent on the radar set and the missile, but in general the missile has a wider range because it's less precise. A plane has a much bigger radar, a much stronger unit, and therefore it's going to be a lot more accurate, but in this example the change is going to be 50 kilometers an hour. So if it's going to go between 1250 and 1150, the radar will simply filter you out. So arbitrary numbers here, but you can tell 1300, it's going to be 100% visible. At like the border, you're going to be like 50-50. And if you are within the bandwidth, you are going to be invisible. Keep in mind that the percentages here are not your radar signature. You are either in the filter or you are not. I'm simply saying that if you are staying at 1200, it's much easier to stay within the bandwidth than it is when you are staying at 1250. Because if you are standing at 1250, you are going to bounce into like 1252 sometimes, and you are going to be visible, making it easier for the enemy radar to actually track you. And with pulse Doppler, the ground still interferes a little bit. So if you are looking up at someone, you're going to have an easier time locking them as when you are looking down at them, especially if they are sub, as of right now, 60 meters. Now they might change this, but if you are below 60 meters, then the radar is still going to have a hard time picking you up. And you might notice this if you are trying to lock onto someone else and he's very low. You can see that the box is just moving all over the place. That is multipathing. Listen to missile number 1. There is one. And be careful if the missiles come from directly above you. They might just splash into the ground and you're probably going to get hit anyway. And here comes missile number 2. Be careful of uneven terrain. If you're at like 50 meters and there is like a dip in the ground that's 20 meters, you're now at 70 meters of altitude, you're not in multipath range, and you are just going to die. Try to use the entire mountain instead of a little mound of dirt, because multipathing as of right now isn't super reliable anymore, which is kind of funny considering, well, last patch it was the meta. And then we have chaff, and chaff is pretty simple. What it does, it fools the radar. Now if you are using a non-pulse Doppler, your radar is going to be very susceptible to it. However, if you have your target locked on, just as you saw in the intro, if you then chaff, yes, it will lock onto the chaff, but with continuous wave or CW, it will still go for the target because it's moving. And this is because it has a Doppler filter, and this has everything to do with speed again. So if you want to fool this radar, you want to chaff before he fires, and if he locks onto the chaff and fires the missile at the chaff, then yes, the missile is going to be fooled basically every time. If you chaff after he launched, you basically have to defeat him in the same way as the pulse Doppler ones. But we'll get to that in a minute. Keep in mind that the very early missiles get instantly fooled by chaff even after the launch if they don't have CW. Now with pulse Doppler it's a little bit different. As we talked about, it's all about speed ranges. And chaff is very, very slow. It slows down quick and it then just kind of floats. So even though the RCS or the radar cross section is so massive, it never gets picked up because it just falls into the filter. Now, if you are also falling into the filter by maintaining a proper notch angle and you drop some chaff, it might fool the radar a little bit. So if you are like about to border on that range where you start almost getting picked up and you drop some chaff, you might be able to overwhelm the radar. Now, don't see this as a win button. This is more of a booster. So if you are like on the border, if you're not maintaining a perfect angle, you might get out of it with chaff, but don't rely on it too much. See it more of a helpful booster instead of a win button. This type of combat has a lot of terms that you need to know to be able to follow what I'm saying, so let's get started with the first few. Let's get started. We have the F-15 on the right and it's the orange color, and here comes our first term. When you fly directly at your opponent, you are going in hot because you are engaging your enemy. The closure rate is of course the 2 kilometers an hour stacked directly on top of each other. Then we have the second one, we have going cold. We are flying away from the enemy, and it sounds a bit backwards because cold, you're looking at the afterburner, it doesn't really make sense. But in radar missile terms, going cold means pointing your ass towards your enemy. 1200 kilometers an hour yet again, and this time the closure rate is 0 kilometers an hour. And you might think, well, 0, that means that the pulse Doppler won't see it right. But no, the radar is looking for 1200. So flying directly away from your enemy is still going to get you picked up by the enemy radar. And you can already kind of tell where this is going. Going hot, you're too fast. Going cold, you're too slow. So what do? You start notching. And by notching, I mean flying 90 degrees to the enemy plane. This way, the plane is gaining on you as fast as it is gaining on the ground. And if you stay within the bandwidth of 50 kilometers an hour up or down, you're now essentially invisible because the radar is filtering you out because it thinks you are part of the terrain. It sounds kind of stupid, I know. And that's because it is. Now what the enemy can do to kind of counter your notch, to actually get a radar signature again, is simply fly straight. Instead of chasing you into the notch, where you basically always point 90 degrees to the enemy plane until he gets close enough. If he just kind of flies straight and he passes behind you, you can tell that it kind of isn't 90 degrees anymore. So you have to adjust properly, you have to see what the enemy is doing and make sure that you actually maintain a proper notch angle. The next thing is going to be the gimbal limit. It's essentially how much the radar can look left, right, up and down. Because as you can tell, the radar is mounted on the gimbal. And the limit is just how much it can angularly tilt to a certain direction. This is plane specific. Not every plane has the exact same gimbal limit. And the gimbal limit comes into play with the tactic called cranking. Now this is mostly important when it comes down to semi-active radar homing missiles, but it can also be used with FOX-3s as well. Now for the sake of the argument, both planes are using the same missile here and they shot at the exact same time. So guess what, if you shoot directly at each other and you fly exactly at each other, the missiles reach each other at the same time and you just blow each other up, and you want to avoid this. And to avoid this, what you can do is you can start cranking. In this engagement, we are again shooting the same missile at the exact same time, so if we do nothing, we blow each other up. But the red Su-27 turns out, and this does two things. The blue missile has to turn and lose energy, while also flying a longer path, because he's not flying directly at it anymore. Keep note of your gimbal limit though, you need to keep your enemy in the radar scope, especially if you are using a semi-active radar homing missile, because if you turn out too much, you basically start notching and you might defeat his missile, but you defeated your own missile in the process, which kind of defeats the point. And then once you start getting closer, you can tell that the blue missile is going slightly slower now, because it has to turn, it has to lead. And the red missile can just fly full speed directly at the blue F-15. And by the time the blue missile reaches the red Su-27, the F-15 is already in his next game, dying to another missile. And you might have noticed that the red Su-27 starts turning back in, and again it's the gimbal limit. If you start getting closer, the angle is going to be a little bit steeper, and to compensate you have to turn in a little bit to give your radar the ability to actually look at your enemy. And it's a little bit confusing, so let me simplify it for you. Blue line is flying perfectly straight, red guy is cranking, and you can tell that the green missile line is much shorter than the yellow one. And also keep in mind that the yellow missile is also traveling slower, because it actually has to lead, making it less effective and taking even longer to travel the same distance as well. Now this also works with FOX-3 missiles, of course. At longer range you want to make sure that you actually guide in the missile before you start going defensive. If the enemy is not shooting anything back at you, it's of course not as important, but it's always a good idea to keep close to a notch angle, so that if he shoots back at you, you are very quick to respond. Also keep in mind that if you only crank and the enemy does it as well, guess what, it's mirrored, you both end up eating shit at the exact same time. So yes, you have to do a little bit more than simply cranking. Now let's put these things together. We have the F-pull maneuver. So first thing, you start engaging. You start going into a little bit of a crank, but again, don't forget about your gimbal limit. It's not about guiding in the missile, it's about knowing where he is, because we are actually going to be waiting until he fires at us. And as you can see, the missile has to lead all the way to the top of the screen now. And what are we gonna do is kill all of its speed with a very simple maneuver. We're actually going to turn into it, and as we nose over his plane, we're going to fire a missile of our own directly at him, and then we're going to continue to turn out and basically maintain the crank just in the opposite direction. And what this does is make sure that your missile can fly directly at the enemy, while the enemy now has to, from all the way leading to the top of the picture to leading all the way at the bottom, because it's trying to intersect you. And this little maneuver cost him 50 years of his life, and he's essentially out of energy, while your Sigma missile can fly directly at the opponent without much energy loss at all. And you completely reverse the situation. He is in more danger than you now, you shot it at a closer range, your missile has more energy, and he has to defend at this point. If he doesn't, he is very likely to die to this missile. Now the funny thing is that if he's using a semi-active radar homing missile, when he starts defending, he basically lost the engagement, you now have position, you can close the gap, and he dies. If it's a FOX-3, you can start cranking to the opposite direction again, and guess what, you basically double F-pull this missile, because it's not gonna have the energy to track you at all. Now if he does have FOX-3s, he's likely to shoot another one before he turns out, to put you in the defensive again, and you get this back and forth tennis match, but I'll give you some examples later on in this video to go a little bit more in depth. And then we have the no escape zone, or the NEZ, or the minimum abort range, or the MAR, and they are the exact same term, except the NEZ is the offensive and the MAR is the defensive term. Now the NEZ is dependent on a few things. It's missile performance, it's the vector of your aircraft, it's the speed of your aircraft, as well as the altitude. So this is an ever-changing thing. For today, I'm just going to take into account the missile performance, just so there isn't too many variables. And you can tell that the circle isn't a perfect circle. That's because the more the missile has to turn to the sides, the more energy it will lose, the less energy it will have. But what do these things actually mean? The no escape zone is not the range in which your missile is sure to kill them. It's, as the name implies, it's the range at which the enemy will not be able to escape. So if the enemy is outside your no escape zone, it can simply go cold, bleed the missile of energy, and simply just leave. If you enter the MAR, the missile will reach you no matter what you do. And it doesn't matter if you start notching it, if you dodge it outright, if you make it fly into the ground, or if you pull some magic out of your ass. All it means is that it will reach you. You need to do something, and it doesn't matter if it's decoying or simply dodging it, as long as the missile doesn't actually impact you. And this is why range is so important. Here you can see that the F-15 has a much bigger no escape zone than the Su-27, because the R-77 simply has less range. And if the Su-27 wants to get the F-15 in his no escape zone, it has to enter the no escape zone of the F-15, putting it at a massive disadvantage, because the second we enter, he's already shooting a missile at us, and if you want to get him in the no escape zone, you will have to keep pushing quite a bit, and you're basically going to put yourself at a massive disadvantage. Now yes, you can fire at a longer range. The issue is that he can very easily dodge your missile by simply going cold. The missile is already on your way, and he will have initiative, and he will be able to just keep you at arm's length. Now of course this is a little bit over exaggerated. Yes, the difference in range is there. It's not that big that by the time you get to shoot yours, you're already dead. This is just for demonstration purposes, and I hope that it portrays a clear picture. And then we have altitude, and altitude plays a factor in a multitude of things. First of all, the missile performance. The missile at high altitude has more range because the air is thinner at high altitude, and therefore the missile experiences less drag. And overall, this just has benefits. Second of all is missile performance in relation to the aircraft. At high altitude, the missile suffers way less from the thin air than an entire aircraft does, making it even harder to dodge. And the NEZ here might be a little bit confusing, because you can tell that if I shoot up, the NEZ actually becomes a little bit bigger, and that's because the thinner air contributes way more to the effective range than gravity does. Keep in mind, this is not the max range, this is the no escape zone. Let's take a look at the first example here. The blue F-15 is going to be at an energy disadvantage by being slightly below the red Su-27. Now we are going to be using the same missile performance yet again for demonstration purposes, but you can instantly tell that being at an energy disadvantage makes his NEZ smaller. So now the F-15 has to push into the MAR of the Su-27 to actually catch the Su-27 into the NEZ of the F-15. Now this looks like a massive disadvantage, and it partially is, but the F-15 actually has an advantage of its own. He has the defender's advantage in terms of actually defeating the missile. Now if the F-15 manages to get the Su-27 into his NEZ, the F-15 will almost surely kill the Su-27 just because of how radars work. Now I'm not gonna go into the science of it, but shooting up at someone or being at extreme altitudes makes your radar much harder to notch. Additionally, being below someone sometimes actually gives you the NEZ advantage, because you are shooting up at them and you are in much thicker air, meaning that you can actually kind of camp outside of NEZ on the absolute border. But this is not super realistic, but I wanted to include it anyway in case you have a question about it. Let's get started with looking at what the Su-27 can do when it's being engaged by the F-15. The most likely two scenarios are these. The Su-27 shoots first because it has the F-15 caught in its NEZ. It's a sure shot, and it will now go into thicker air to defend and go into an area where it's slightly easier to notch. Might the F-15 actually close the gap on him? Now we are going to split S, sacrifice some energy. The F-15 is likely to send something back at us, and at high altitude, even outside of the MAR, it is pretty dangerous. The margins for error are simply much smaller up there. Energy isn't everything, and trying to maintain your energy advantage might actually get you killed in the long run. Because yes, you might have the range advantage, but it's like fighting a guy with a sword and shield when you have a bow and arrow. If the guy with a sword and shield closes the gap, you're very likely to die, because he now has the close range brawling advantage. So how do we combat this? Let's zoom out a little bit to actually make this a little bit clearer, and the Su-27 is back at the top. For clarity's sake, the blue line is going to be the missile, the red line is going to be the Su-27. The Su-27 is likely to do a split S here to pull the missile into thicker air and not be a sitting duck at high altitude. Obviously you shoot a missile back at the F-15, but that's not what this point is about. You do a split S, you pull it into thicker air, you go cold, and the missile is lofting at you, so first it goes up, and then it has to pass through the thicker air, and while you're going cold, the missile just runs out of energy, and you are completely free. What you can also do, and this also works if you are inside of the MAR, you simply dive straight down, you let the missile lead under the ground, and if you then pull up just above the ground, the missile will have led so much that it basically flies directly into the terrain. And you are again free to do what you want. You can also go hot in this engagement here. Go F-pole, terrain mask, make sure that you multipath, do whatever you want. Just make sure that you do the correct thing, because multipathing when the missile comes directly from on top, for example, will very likely end in you dying, because it will splash directly below you and blow you up regardless. Let's take a look at some examples. So we have this F-15 locked up at 10 kilometers and there's an F4F on our right. Now I see that the F-15 is shooting, we don't get an RWR spike, so I know it's not shot at me because we are in the active range. So if he shoots at me, I get a warning. The F-15 goes cold, I chase the F4 for a little bit, notice that he turns around, it's gonna be a waste of a missile, so I lock the F-15 up as I see that he's trying to go hot again. He's going way too slow, I try to get off-bore as quickly as possible, we go into a notch, F-15 is way too slow and he dies. Next up, we are in the F-15 this time around and I'm getting locked from roughly behind me. I just went cold, I defeated this missile by flying away. Don't worry, I'm about to do it again. I see a contrail in the very back and the RWR is telling me that I'm being shot at from the right. Now I don't see a contrail anymore, I don't know where he is exactly, but at this point I have a feeling that he is actually lower than me. There he is, there is the dot, there is the missile diamond. We start going defensive, we turn out, I notice that the missile burned out. I'm gonna drop a little bit of altitude to pull the missile into thicker air. And the missile is essentially defeated. We drop our fuel tanks and we go into a notch. And it's important to either have a tall box ACM mode or HMD so you can lock your enemy up without sacrificing too much position and fly directly hot into your opponent. Wait a little bit longer, try to stay off bore, shoot the missile off, instantly go back into a notch. And because I turned out way earlier, I have much more time. He was a little bit too greedy, flew at me for a little bit too long. Ends up eating it directly in the face, and we are completely free. Dodge the missile, go cold in case he re-engages, but he's already dead. We are engaging someone on the horizon, 15 kilometers away at about 8.5 kilometers. Now the F-16 on my left just died, and I know it's a JAS-39C, and he just killed him with an R darter, so he has a maximum of 3 left. I have him locked up and I'm seeing what he's trying to do. The second I see that he's going slightly hot, I shoot off the missile and we go into a notch. Keep in mind at high altitude, notch windows are smaller and this is inherently a little bit more dangerous. We notch the missile properly, FOX-3 defeated, and we are going to be turning back in to lock him up. Now personally I would have stayed a little bit more off-bore, but I'm waiting for this guy to actually go cold again. I'm baiting him into going for us. We shoot the missile off, we notch, he does the same thing. And again, we don't hit each other. But this time, the JAS-39 goes a little bit too slow, takes a little bit too long, and I'm gonna lock him up with the missile. I'm gonna fire it, this time we stay properly off-bore, and we go a little bit lower. Now this time around, he turned out just after I fired, he tried to get the shot off, and because he was choosing between defensive and offensive, he ends up eating it also directly in the face. Now let's take a look at this from a different perspective. We are gonna use sensor view, and we are gonna make sure that we actually know what's going on. So here the R darter engages the F-16. The F-16 flies directly into it, notches way too late, ends up eating it. JAS-39 notches properly, missile misses, and now the engagement starts that you just witnessed on the screen. So we are gonna wait for him to turn back into us, because shooting at someone that's already notching or going cold is essentially a waste of a missile and something that I don't recommend. We lock him up, we fire at him, he instantly starts dumping a lot of chaff and he goes into a notch. We do the exact same thing. Missile gets defeated, you can tell that the Seeker isn't tracking anymore. He makes it very close, but he manages to notch it as well, and we re-engage. We lock him up, he drops a fuel tank, I think that red thing is, and we shoot the missile at the same time. Now at this kind of range, just make sure that you go defensive properly. He's going at us, and this time we cut it kind of close, and we notch it at the very last moment. We re-engage, the JAS-39 is a little bit too slow to react, our missile is already on the way, he's too slow to really do anything, and he's gonna end up eating that thing directly in the cockpit. And then something that you want to do with missiles with less range, like the R-77 and something like the Mika. Using terrain is very beneficial, because it makes it so that even though you might be in his MAR, you're still relatively safe. So here we lock him up, we go into the terrain, he doesn't have any terrain to go into, we straight up block his missile, And mine goes on its merry way because, well, it's a FOX-3 and it will just maintain the lock. We then lock onto the MiG-29. We just kind of go into a notch, but he's already engaged by multiple people, and also he just ends up eating it. And then lastly we have the Mikas for the Mirage, and really there is no difference here other than the missile range. So we are gonna kind of look at this in the exact same way that we have been for the rest of the video. I lock him up at TWS, there is no hard lock just yet, he hasn't fired at us just yet, so I'm just waiting for him to get a little bit closer. I start preemptively cranking a little bit to make sure that he gets as close as possible, and then at like 8 kilometers, and he's at high altitude flying directly into it, he is going to die to that. There's really no way around it. We notch his missile, and there is going to be kill number 1. If you want to see the full engagements, I have them all on my channel, and I'll link them in the description. And here, yet again, with the Mika, I'm gonna wait for him to get a little bit closer, but I'm already prematurely angling my plane away from him, so that I know that I am able to notch him properly, in case he actually does engage us. Now, he doesn't know where this is coming from exactly, it seems like, because he's basically flying straight into it. So in this case, we just get a free kill. But then we fly a little bit straight, and we find someone else, and it's an F-15 on the deck. Now, I'm gonna again assume that he's going to engage me, so I'm prematurely aiming my nose away, I'm shooting a missile at him, and then once the missile goes active, I just go into a notch. Now he is not really notching my missile, and again he's also going to be eating this one. And then we have some actual like long range BVR. Now we're gonna lock him up, and I'm not gonna fire it at max range. This is a waste of a missile, and yes, I have 6 of them, so I can waste one and be fine, but I still would like to get it a little bit closer. So I'm gonna wait for him to get to about 35 kilometers at the very minimum until I actually fire these missiles off. And then we're gonna do a plethora of things. So we lock him up, we shoot at about 33, 34, and we start cranking a little bit. And I'm not gonna crank all the way, I'm gonna let this missile be guided in by my radar, while also holding off a little bit of an angle, so it takes their missile a little bit longer to get to us. I go into STT lock, it's a little bit more reliable. As I say that, it breaks lock, but the missile is now close enough, and I can go into the defensive posture and just kind of start notching his missile. After I notch his missile for a little bit, I start turning out, and I simply go cold. He dies, we are now free to do what we want, we just want to make sure that we don't let his landmine basically glide into us. So I'm gonna take one extra precaution, where I turn out for a little bit, go cold, go back into the notch, and then after a little bit I start turning back in. But notice that I'm going Mach 1.5, so this missile has to be absolutely hauling ass to actually start hitting us again. Now the missile completely misses us, and we are completely free to do what we want again. Now what you can do once the missile actually runs out of booster, let it glide for like 10 to 15 seconds, and then if you climb like 500 meters, it's very unlikely that you will have a landmine incident where you kind of just let the missile glide into you. We lock onto this guy, I'm not sure what it is, we go directly head on with it. I should already go a little bit into a notch, but I'm having a hard time actually locking into him. So I go into the ACM mode, get a hard lock, STT, go a little bit off bore, wait for him to get closer, and then we just turn out. He's flying directly into us, we are already turning out, he dies, we notch, and I mean that's all she wrote. And then for planes like the SU-27 and the Mirage, where you just have less range on your FOX-3s, it's a good idea to use some terrain masking just so you can get close to people, so you can pop out and then just kind of turn back out into the terrain again. We lock him up, he's gonna die because he's trying to get a missile out on us, and we are very safe here because even though we are in his MAR, there's a massive mountain here, so all I have to do is just dip back behind it and we're safe. And really that's the only real thing that you can do with these planes, because you are at a massive disadvantage when it comes to range, so maneuverability of the missile at medium to longer ranges, and you really just have to put yourself in harm's way to actually engage these people. So I like to just kind of mountain shark, lock people up, pop on over, and then we just turn around again. I shoot a missile at the second dude as well, because I don't want him to push me. I want to go back to my safe mountain. Even though it makes me miss a missile, at least it gives me the room to go back in there and then do it all over again. Don't forget, RRB and Sim are not 1v1s. You still have a team, and you don't only have FOX-3s, you also have IRCCM IR missiles, for example, AIM-9Ms, Magic 2s, R-73s, and those are all still usable. Don't forget that you also still have a gun. Here I go into the terrain, I let my Mirage engage the F-16, and I go into the mountains. I turn around, he has no idea that I did turn around, and then I just park myself firmly on his ass. I hope I covered everything, I hope it was clear, I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, make sure to let me know down in the comments. I'll try to answer as much as I can. I tried to cover everything, but this is a very vast subject. Once you get all the knowledge down, it becomes very easy to put into practice. You just need to know what all the intricate details are, and once you do, it is 95% just decision making. So we're gonna put this last F-16 back to the hangar, and then I'm gonna put you all to sleep. Thank you all for watching, and you'll see me in the next one.